and welcome to the 3D Blu-ray bunker. This is where I look exclusively at 3D Blu-ray films, not to do a movie review, but to focus almost entirely on the film's 3D, with just a brief word at the end about the film itself. And this time I'm looking at Luc Besson's 2017 film Valerian and the City of 1,000 Planets. This has got an aspect ratio of 2.39 to 1, and it was post-converted into 3D. There's definitely some pretty spectacular 3D on show in this film, and right from the beginning we get a taste of where the 3D works best, which is mostly in the external space shots. I think this view of the space station is quite superior to any of the space station shots in the film Gravity, which was heavily praised for its 3D. Here there's just much more depth and separation of elements and overall volume in this thing than any of Gravity's structures showed. This all feels big and spacious, and there's some stuff going on out in front of the screen with the craft here, but also the station has three-dimensional volume even when we see it in the distance, so I really like these views. And I also really like the admittedly unrealistically three-dimensional view of a spherical planet like this, which is sitting in obviously different 3D space to the backdrop, where even the stars themselves have a bit of depth and separation amongst them. And because the design of this film is insanely rich and detailed, there's just so much stuff for them to put into 3D space that the odd bit here and there isn't done properly. I think one of the more noticeable conversion errors was the bridge here in the lower part of the screen, where all of the lights that are obviously behind it have been stuck into the same space as the bridge. And that might not sound like a big deal, and to a lot of people perhaps it isn't, but I do think that the brain has a very clever, if slightly annoying, ability to notice these little flaws, and it triggers alarm bells that something's not right. It's the same sort of thing with digital characters when their mouth movements, incredibly well animated though they may be, just somehow look that little bit off, and it can spoil the illusion, and I use that as a comparison because we see a lot of it in this film too. Anyway, that bridge appears fleetingly in a fly-through shot of a huge location in the film. Again, it's one that's rammed with a staggering amount of detail, and the 3D here looks okay, but Besson's camera often does this extended swooping and weaving movement, which I think isn't the best way to show off the 3D, and almost certainly makes the views significantly harder to convert, which I think is why the 3D in these sequences looks quite nice, but not stunning. So it's when we get views of these massive structures where the camera sits still, or moves very slowly, that they tend to do a much better job of implementing the 3D. So like here, there's a much better feeling of depth and separation than when the camera's flying around all over the place. And the views of his spaceship work a lot better when the backdrop isn't swirling around, like in this bit where they let his craft do the movement through space whilst everything else pretty much stays put. And that ship often looks really nice in its own 3D space, like way above the surface here, and moving down closer to it. It's really nice stuff. Sometimes though, even when the camera's fairly stationary, I do think that the 3D still suffers a bit simply because of the huge amount of detail in the frame. These views are so stuffed with visuals that I think they just weren't able to put absolutely everything into its own correct space. So there is still a feeling of depth, but there's just not the amount of separation between everything that I think there would be in an absolute top-class job. It does feel to me a bit like maybe they looked at whatever their budget was for the conversion and basically decided to go hard in a few places and go pretty soft everywhere else. So there's not really a consistent feel to the power of the 3D here. This means that an awful lot of scenes are milder than you might reasonably expect them to be, and there's just not a lot of interesting spatial information dialed into the 3D often. So shots of crowds, for example, where you often see clear and distinct separation in between everyone, are left feeling not exactly flat, but quite reduced in the amount of 3D effect. And I think that's particularly disappointing when the shot looks like it's loaded with composition along the Z-axis, but not a huge amount of work seems to have been done to show that off. And in even simpler shots, like the characters and their spears here, with one of them even poking at the camera, but the 3D here is quite lackluster. Same goes for thrusting her sword through the circular character here. It's a very brief shot, but quite disappointing in how ineffective the 3D is. Or here's Kara modelling something from Luc Besson's 2017 summer collection. I mean, the outfit's nice enough, but I'm not convinced by the headwear. And you've probably seen how deep and impressive Kate Winslet's massive hat was when James Cameron put it into 3D space in his Titanic conversion. Well, this hat's much bigger than that one, but it covers about as much 3D space as Billy Zane's bowler hat did in Cameron's film, so this feels surprisingly weak too. And these characters have very three-dimensionally appropriate faces, but they never really occupy 3D space in a way you might expect them to. And there are quite a few times where it feels like they just didn't bother doing what you'd expect them to with the 3D. Like when he's been enshrouded here, there's not really any sense of space between him and what he's covered in. The 3D's doing nothing to support the effect. And this character has sort of lights on their skin, but those lights sit on the skin rather than under it, which is where I'd expect to see them. So in other words, the 3D's often just not interesting. There are a huge amount of screens in the film, and a lot of these views from behind the screen looking back to the person looking at it. It's perfectly good 3D, and the first time we see it, it's quite nice. There's certainly a good sense of depth between the screen and whoever's looking at it, but as it goes on, and there's more and more of it, it starts to feel like it's a bit of a shame that several hundred years into the future, these screens are all two-dimensional, which doesn't bode well for the often dangled carrot of glasses-free 3D. And what looks like some sort of hologram here is also two-dimensional, which obviously isn't very good 3D. There are quite a few guns held out towards the camera, but none of them ever pop out of the screen to any degree worth getting excited about. And this double-barreled one doesn't look like it's framed that well for a 3D view, because you'd normally want to keep some of the barrel visible to feel the depth of it, and you can barely see these two guns at all. The 3D doesn't help, as they barely emerge from the screen, and they manage to look quite flat when they do. So these are far from classic 3D gunshots. Another surprisingly ineffective moment is this ship emerging into the shot, and you really assume from this view that it's popping out of the screen, but it isn't. I'm not saying it should, but this is a silly science fiction film. It's just the kind of movie where you'd anticipate things popping out of the screen, but that's not really what the 3D here is all about. Another example of where it looks like they weren't bothering is this one. If you've seen the 3D film Need for Speed, there's a great shot in that where some out-of-focus background lights are put into different 3D space, and it looks excellent, but they don't bother doing anything like that here, so this background is totally flat. So I think I said at the top that there's some spectacular 3D in the film, and I mentioned a tiny bit of it, and then I started moaning about how less impressive so much of it is. Well, there really is some great 3D that I absolutely loved, so lots of positives here, like an awesome view of these robots working on some stuff, and this is superb 3D. Maybe that's helped by the sudden change of colour palette too, so this deep golden view is suddenly very striking. Some of the low-key stuff is impressive too, and I always think that if you do a character introduction shot in good 3D, then it makes more significance of the moment. And when we first see Rihanna's character, she's sitting in her own 3D space in a nice and bold way. So I'd call this one of the film's more subtly effective pieces of 3D, and I guess her pose here helps to make it a little bit more noticeable too. And even if quite a lot of the film looks like it wasn't really shot with 3D in mind, there are several sequences that look like 3D was very much being taken into account from early on, like blasting through several floors and layers of the structure here, and his run through various bits of scenery in this scene work pretty well. It's all a bit quick again, but it does work. And there are views looking down where height is an issue, which are really effective too, especially when there's an element of danger going on. My favourite being this view down a deep cliff edge, where the 3D's made all the more impressive by the addition of those pink things. And this fella falling does look really good too. And then there's more space stuff, loads of great moments, like these trails coming off the back make this one look a bit reminiscent of some of the views in Tron Legacy, but the 3D here is far more impressive. And in one moment, the shot begins with his little craft flying through fairly uninteresting 3D space, and then bang, we're hit with a genuinely stunning piece of 3D. This view is properly incredible, so good, and it looks to me like maybe this was even natively rendered 3D CG. There's a huge amount of depth and separation in between all of these ships. It reminds me of a similar sort of view in The Rise of Skywalker, but where the 3D was very weak and unimpressive, but here it's superb. I think this is the film's clear 3D highlight, and we get to see this view quite a few times, and it's always dazzling. And to me, this is also a great example of how important 3D can be to make sense of an image. So whilst in 2D, movement certainly does help to identify where the various craft are, but in a still, you're totally unable to see the literally several dozen craft that are in the same part of the frame as the space station, directly in front of it, but in 3D you can see every single one of them very clearly. This is just awesome, and I'd love to have a high-quality lenticular stereo print of this image hanging on the wall. It's absolutely gorgeous. 3D, I think, at its most spectacular. So just a quick word about the film itself. I remember seeing a trailer for this in the cinema where they played out a load of the film's colourful and enticing visuals accompanied by the fantastic surround mix of the Beatles song Because, and as an audio-visual package that was a great little 2-minute film. Now I confess I was never a massive fan of Luc Besson's The Fifth Element, and this film is a very close relative of that one, maybe like an annoying brat of a cousin with more money but less brains, with its audacious visuals plus the odd irritating character. There's a story at its heart that didn't manage to engage me, as there seemed to be a lot of extraneous stuff going on around it that left it all feeling a bit messy and unfocused. It's a shame because I love the fact that they took a gamble on a mega budget movie that wasn't a sequel, a remake, or even really a known commodity at all, unless you're a French comic book fan, which I don't expect you are. It's well known that something like over halfway into filming Back to the Future, they faced the dawning realisation that their lead actor, Eric Stoltz, just wasn't right for the film, and so they made the dramatic decision to recast him, brought in Michael J. Fox, refilmed it, and ended up making one of the best-loved films of all time. I'm not saying that a similar moment of clarity could have turned this movie into a classic, but I do think that even Eric Stoltz would have made for a better leading man in this film than the guy who plays Valerian. I find it hard to believe that they looked at the results they were getting in each day and thought there was anything approaching a spark and chemistry between their leading couple. I'm confident enough that both Dane DeHaan and Cara Delevingne are both capable of giving great performances in the right roles, and in fairness to them, they didn't have all that much to work with here, but the lack of charm and charisma on show is pretty fatal. Their performances, and really much more him than her, played to me as being by far the least three-dimensional thing in the film. I don't know, maybe the original comic book was supposed to be about a pair of annoying young adults, but I don't think that translates too well to a big movie. And the idea of any romantic connection between these two was about as alien as some of the CG characters in the film. Speaking of which, some of those CG aliens had such human-like faces that I've no idea why they went to the trouble of creating them digitally. Why not just use a bunch of guys with some rubber ears and a bald cap and save a ton of money? Because every time they spoke, I thought it was very fake-looking and distracting. At one point, the film goes out of its way to reference Star Wars with a quick escape through a hatch that winds up in a trash disposal, and it just left me wondering how many tens of thousands of dollars they spent on that just to make a Star Wars reference. And more than that, by deliberately evoking Star Wars, I only felt all the more let down by this film's uninspiring story and characters. There's a weird bit with Rihanna, who actually gives one of the better performances, but there's an extended scene of her doing a dance routine where her outfits keep changing digitally, and I thought this was a bit odd, as there's a genuine stage act where people do exactly the same thing, the amazing quick costume change routine, but they do it for real right there in front of you, and to me, that's a really good example of one of the pitfalls of CG. It just looks digital, and as a result, it kind of perversely ends up feeling less magical than reality. On the plus side, it does often look incredible, with some really inventive and sumptuous visuals. I also like the way Valerian's automatically fitting helmet that came out of his suit appeared in a genuinely physically believable way, unlike those Marvel ones which seem to digitally materialise out of nothing, which is another example I think of CG pushing things too far and destroying a magical feeling rather than creating one. So that was a plus. And of course, there's quite a bit of extremely nice 3D on show too. Anyway, feel free to ignore my negativity, as I'm sure the film wasn't made for a grumpy old man like me, but probably aimed more at the less cynical at heart, or maybe at 10-year-olds who might find all of its silly aliens a lot more endearing than I did, and they might find the forced humour funny too. And they might even think the two leads were grown-ups behaving in a believable way. Maybe it plays better to a French audience, but I did not care for it. So I hope you found this in some way useful, and if so, I hope you'll join me again soon for another 3D Blu-ray review. Until then, thanks for looking on this one, cheers for now, bye bye.